Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Big Data London webinar. Today, we're focusing on graph data science. So I'm Andy Steed, Content Director of Big Data London, and joining me today is Alicia Frame from Neo4j. Hi, Alicia. And Matthew Selwood from IQVIA. So, hi, Matthew.
Hi.
So these sessions are designed to be interactive. Please send in your questions at any point using the questions function, and I'll endeavour to ask as many as I possibly can at the end of the presentations. But without further ado, I'd like to bring on our first presenter. Over to you, Alicia.
Thank you so much. Let me pull up my screen. Awesome. And so thank you all so much for joining us today. So I'm going to be giving the first talk, talking about graph data science and what's the big deal? Why do I keep telling people about it? What's going on? So for folks who aren't super familiar with graphs or Neo4j or graph data science in general, I wanted to start out with a super quick overview of graphs, graph databases, and kind of the vocabulary of what I'm going to be presenting about today. So kind of fundamentals, Neo4j is a graph database. And what that means is we are a labeled property graph. So we store data instead of in tables, like you might think of in SQL, as a graph with nodes and relationships. And nodes are things like nouns. They're entities in your graph, and they can have labels. So in this example, our nodes are people and cars. And then relationships are the connections between those nodes, and they each have a type. So a person can love another person, or a person can drive a car. So that verb is the relationship. And then you can have properties associated with those nodes or relationships. So people can have names, a person has driven a car since a date, and that's how we store data in Neo4j. So all of your data, instead of being in tables where you're joining tables together to try to get information out, everything is nodes and relationships. So it makes it really easy to query and see the context around your data. And so if you're not familiar with Neo4j, we basically created the labeled property graph as well as Cypher, which is our query language. If you're familiar with SQL, Cypher is how you query graph data. We have thousands of customers worldwide. We have offices in Silicon Valley, London, Munich, Paris, and Malmo. We're widely used, especially in the financial sector, retail, software vendors, as well as in the life sciences, which is what we'll be talking about today. And Neo4j is available as an on-prem database. We're available via different cloud vendors, as well as our database as a service, which is Aura. And when we talk about Neo4j, it's really a graph platform. So at the heart of Neo4j is Neo4j, the graph database, supporting graph transactions, as well as graph analytics. What I'm going to be talking about today is mostly the graph analytics and graph data science side of this platform. When I talk about data science, I really like to make sure we do some level setting in the beginning, because I think a lot of us are data scientists or we're interested in data science, but everyone is defining data science a little bit differently. AI, deep learning, all of that means different things to different people. When I talk about data science, what I'm really talking about is just someone who's using data to answer a question. So that could be through using algorithms for machine learning. It could be through statistics, like I'm doing hypothesis testing or forecasting, or it could be doing visual analysis, doing analytics, building charts and images, basically trying to extract information from the data that you have to answer business questions. What I'm talking about today is graph data science. So graph data science is really basically using relationships between your data points to answer questions. So it's a science-driven approach to gain knowledge from the relationships and structure in your data, usually to power predictions and answer questions. And so when we talk about typical data science, you're probably familiar with pandas data frames or, God forbid, sheets in Excel. All of your data is in a table. You have rows and columns. There's not really a way to understand the relationships between those data points. In the toy example at the beginning, I have people and they know each other. And those properties like person's name, demographic information, those are available in a table, but you can't get at who knows who loves who hates who. So with graph data science, we're bringing those relationships between your data points to the forefront to answer questions and improve your ability to make predictions. I talked about in data science on the previous slide having different tools in your toolbox. When we talk about the tools that graph data scientists are using, we're really talking about three things. So the first is graph queries. And I already mentioned Cypher, which is the Neo4j query language. This is really, I have my data in a graph and I want to ask a question about the relationships between my data points. So match this pattern in my graph. We have graph algorithms, and those are basically unsupervised machine learning techniques. And I'll spend most of this presentation talking about them, which can tell you things about the topology of your data. What are the clusters? What are the communities? Which nodes are important? And then we have visualization tools like Bloom and Linkurious to let you explore and understand your data from a visual perspective. And then taking all of those tools together in our toolbox is how we do graph data science. And when people are like, okay, you've said a lot of words, I still don't quite understand. I really like the motivating example of everyone has heard the phrase, it's not what you know, but oh, there's been an error to Google. Great. Sorry about that. It's who you know and where they are. So, oh dear. Reload. Sorry about this. This way you guys know it is actually a live demo. Crossing my fingers that it works this time. Cool. So it's not what you know, it's who you know and where they are. So everyone has heard this saying, right? When you talk about how did you get your last job? Is it based on how old you were, your demographic data, where you lived, what you got your degree in? Or was it based off of you knew someone at that company who told you the job was open, or a former boss wrote you a recommendation? Or at your last job, you'd helped out with a project outside of your team and helped build up your portfolio, and someone at your new employer noticed that. So it's not your rows and columns, it's your relationships. And that's a really easy to think about example, like, oh yeah, I did get my job based on talking to this person or this personal relationship. But even though that's a cool example, this is also real. There was a recent paper and a really good book called Connected that says basically the relationships between people let you make better predictions than you could with any other data. And so really we're talking about graph data science lets you formally take advantage of those relationships to make better predictions. And these two, this thought process is, we're talking about social relationships, but it's not just social networks, it's all different kinds of networks. So the TLDR, so what am I doing with graphs? Why am I bothering? The basic idea is that we're going to help you make better predictions using the data you already have. So I'm sure most people here who are data scientists have data that they're using to build models, to do analytics, to answer questions. What we're saying is not throw that out, it's useless. We're saying that by representing that data as a graph, you can explicitly understand the network structure, the relationships between those data points, and add highly predictive features to your machine learning models extracted from those relationships between your data points to increase your accuracy. You can also answer questions that you just can't answer without relationships. So a really easy example here is something like link prediction. So if I have a network of transactions in a graph, and I want to understand who is going to buy from a merchant next, I'm predicting whether or not there should be an edge there in my graph. The prediction of if there is an edge there, that's really graph first, right? I need to do link prediction. I need to predict where there's a relationship. If my data is not in a graph, that's pretty hard to do. So what we're really saying is using the data you already have, we're going to let you get more out of it. And this isn't just Neo4j inventing a new use case for graph databases. This is really a state of the science industry-wide trend. So if you look at papers that have been published in the last decade or so with keywords around graphs, so graph completion, graph algorithms, graph neural networks, graph learning, there's been a tremendous increase in the number of publications because there's this kind of global consensus forming that the relationships between your data points, the connections between your data points are highly predictive. And we're going to really focus today, I'm going to talk about kind of a life sciences example, and then my colleague Matt is going to talk about a chemistry example, but graph data science is not vertical specific. We're not just like a one-trick pony. GDS can be used across the board. So we have examples from fraud detection where you want to say, I have a transactional graph of individuals making transactions with each other, banks, they have identifiers, they're making purchases. I can use the graph to identify which patterns look fraudulent, which individual customer journeys look unusual, and identify the accounts that are committing fraud. We're really commonly used in disambiguation and segmentation. So if I have marketing data about who's purchasing what, and their customer journeys, their relationships with each other, instead of saying I want to do customer segmentation based on gender, age, where they live, I can say I want to do customer segmentation based on the types of items that they're purchasing and the individuals that they interact with, and get a much more targeted subpopulation. In disambiguation, what we're really talking about is I want to find the unique users. So I have multiple people with identifiers. Maybe they don't have accounts. I want to figure out who's actually a unique viewer. And you can use graph data science for that. Personalized recommendations is quite similar to the segmentation example. We'll spend a lot of time talking about life sciences today, so I'm not going to get into it. Churn prediction is a big use case for GDS. So just like we talked about journeys and kind of these transactional graphs for fraud and customer data, if I have a network of a user interacting with my products and my services, I can use that to figure out who's going to leave my network next. I always like to flag search because search is really where graph data science got started. You probably hear us talk about PageRank. PageRank was the secret sauce behind Google. If anyone remembers back in the dark days of the early 2000s, how do I search the web? What's important? The way we figured out how to index the web was based on identifying importance of websites based on the relationships. GDS is also used in predictive maintenance, cybersecurity. The bottom line here is it's not vertical specific. The technique of understanding that the relationships between your data points are important and that you can use them to improve your inference is important across the board. Three of our big use cases. So GDS as a product from Neo4j was just released in April. And we've had a number of customers give testimonials, talk about how they're using us. Three that are really cool to highlight is AstraZeneca has been using graph data science to understand patient journeys. So what they're doing is they have patient journey data looking at 3 years of visits, tests, and diagnoses with tens of billions of records in a graph. And they're identifying patient journeys that are similar and using graph algorithms, so these are these unsupervised machine learning techniques, to identify communities and good intervention points. So where should I recommend that a patient be targeted with a new drug? Meredith is a major print media corporation, and they're using GDS for disambiguation. So I mentioned this when I talked about how do I identify unique users. What they're doing is they have web data where they have anonymous users accessing websites, and they have cookies in their browser. And they're using graph algorithms to look at that cookie co-occurrence and identify who are the unique users and build up those profiles to improve ad targeting. And what they were actually able to do is from all of this anonymous data, identify over 160 million unique users. And once they were able to associate unique users with these profiles, they were able to drive a 612% increase in traffic. And then finally, when I talk about fraud detection, we've seen a lot of use cases in this space. Understandably, it's kind of the secret sauce, so a lot of companies don't want to say this is how we're doing it. But I've worked with a number of major banks where they've said, look, we know that the majority of credit card fraud is going undetected. We have data on millions of accounts, billions of transactions. We want to identify who's committing first-party fraud, so they're using synthetic identities, and who's committing third-party fraud. And by using graph analytics with queries and algorithms, they were able to find tens of millions of dollars of fraud in the first year. So graph data science is really powerful, not just for one vertical, but anytime you have relationships between your data points. And so hopefully I've gotten you guys excited. You're like, okay, it sounds useful. How do I do this? So when we talk about graph data science, I like to kind of formally talk about two things: graph analytics, which is really when I have a question and I want to interrogate my graph to answer that question. So I want to use queries, algorithms, to say, how many accounts in my graph are 3 hops out from someone committing fraud? Or how many communities are there in my graph? So I'm answering a question. At the other end of the spectrum, we talk about graph-enhanced machine learning. So this is where you're training a model with graphy data. And so I'm doing feature engineering using graph-based features in order to improve my prediction. So I'm pulling in that network structure into my existing machine learning pipeline. When we talk about doing graph data science, just like I talked about analytics versus machine learning, we can also talk about this global versus local spectrum. And so at the local end of the spectrum, we're talking about queries. So I have my data in a graph, and I want to do real-time local decisioning and pattern matching. So I know what I'm looking for, and I just want to support that decision. So tell me how many fraud rings there are. Tell me how many customers are within 2 hops of someone who's churned. It's a specific question that I want to answer. At the other end of the spectrum, we talk about global computation, and this is where the graph algorithms come in. And this is global analysis and iteration, where you're learning the overall structure of your network, you're updating your data, and you're making predictions. And so this is, instead of saying, I want to find how many accounts look like this, you're saying, well, I have my entire transactional graph. I want to understand how many unique communities or clusters are there in that graph of users who interact more frequently with each other than the rest of the users in the graph. So this is, I'm learning something about the structure. I'm really adding data to my data that I already have. In order to kind of make it a little easier to wrap your heads around this, I like to talk about the evolution of graph data science. So I think it can seem a little bit intimidating when it's cool, graph data science, we're going to use relationships, you're going to learn about Neo4j, you're going to learn Cypher, you're going to learn GDS. Really, it's a process. So we start with a knowledge graph, which is I need to have my data in a graph to do graph data science. Building on that, you can do graph analytics. So you start to ask questions about your data. Once you've done graph analytics, you then can do graph feature engineering. So I want to take the questions I was asking, I want to use those as features to make a model. Then you can talk about graph embeddings, which instead of just using a graph algorithm, so instead of saying, I'm going to run PageRank, here's the formula for PageRank, a graph embedding is basically a graph algorithm tailored to your graph. So it learns the features that are important for your data set and your problem. And then kind of at the far end of the spectrum, as you're becoming more advanced in the world of graph data science, you have graph neural networks and you're doing graph native learning. So your graph is an input, you learn on the graph, and the graph is an output. But at each one of these steps, there's tremendous value. And there's kind of, they build on each other. So I'm going to walk through an example using life sciences, going from knowledge graphs through graph feature engineering. And so knowledge graphs, this is step 1. I need a graph to do graph data science. Even just the process of getting your data into a graph is useful. Once you have your data in a graph, you can do graph search and graph queries. So today I'm going to be kind of walking through building on examples from the life sciences. If you're curious about other verticals, we have tons of content around fraud, around customer segmentation. I've got some links at the end. When I talk about drug discovery, knowledge graphs are front and center. So we have referenceable cases with Novartis and the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, where they're using knowledge graphs to mine medical research for insights. So this is taking data from published articles, from big public databases, as well as internal data sets, connecting it up and understanding the relationships between those data points. And by having your data in a knowledge graph, that lets you start to answer some deceptively simple queries. So what completes the connections between these genes and these diseases? How are they associated? How many hops is it between this gene and this disease in this network? And does that tell me anything about the likelihood that they're related? How many genes can be reached 4 hops out from a known drug target? So I have a drug target. How many genes are associated in the same pathways as that gene of interest? What mechanisms in common are there between 2 drugs? Which biological pathways can be regulated by these genes? So once you've pulled all your data in, you're connecting all these different concepts across different verticals, it becomes really easy to start traversing that graph and just answering questions that you wouldn't really be able to get at otherwise. But cool, now you've got your graph, you have some data in a graph, then you can start doing graph analytics. And this is instead of just saying, okay, I'm going to write a Cypher query. This is graph queries and algorithms for offline analysis, where you're really understanding the structure of your data. I've mentioned this a bunch of times. I want to take a second to talk about what are graph algorithms. Basically, they're unsupervised machine learning methods that tell you something about your data. We talk about 5 categories. So we have pathfinding and search, which is really like, what's the shortest path between A and B? Is there a path between A and B? I want to look at the minimum weight spanning tree on my graph and understand what that looks like. So can I find a connection between these things? We have the centrality and importance algorithms. And what these are is they tell you things about which nodes are important. Which nodes are important in the graph based on different ways of calculating importance. So PageRank says these nodes are important based on their relationships and their neighbors' relationships. Betweenness centrality says these nodes are important because they're bridge nodes in the graph. In community detection, what you're doing is you're finding clusters. So these nodes are more closely connected to each other than the rest of the graph. And each of these community detection algorithms uses a different way of finding communities. So weakly connected components is going to find communities based on, this is a disjoint subgraph. Whereas something like Louvain or label propagation is going to find communities where these nodes are more tightly linked to each other, but they may have edges to other communities in the graph. The similarity algorithms are, given a node, given some relationships, how similar are these nodes to each other based on their properties, based on their neighborhoods, and based on their relationships. So each one of these different similarity algorithms can use a different methodology or different data from your graph to understand how similar those nodes are. Then finally, the link prediction algorithms basically say, given a pair of nodes, should there be an edge between them? And each one of these has a different way of calculating that. But together, this gives you a pretty full toolbox of understanding your graph topology and enriching that data. So how do you use graph algorithms in drug discovery? Let's say we have our knowledge graph that we talked about in the last example. We can do things like identifying drug mechanisms and new targets based on your network structure. So we can use centrality algorithms like PageRank and betweenness, so how important are these nodes, to identify essential regulatory genes or drug targets. We can use Louvain, the community detection algorithm, to find protein regulatory networks. So these genes interact more often with each other than with the other genes in the graph. We can use those pathfinding algorithms, so is there a path available, what's the shortest path, to link drug targets to possible outcomes or side effects. And we can use things like node similarity to find structurally similar chemicals. So I have 2 nodes, they're connected to fragments. How similar are they? And Matt will be talking a lot about this later on. And then finally, link prediction is, I want to see there's no edge between these 2 genes. Should there be an edge between them? I can use the link prediction algorithms to calculate that. So once we've done graph analytics, so we have our data in a graph, we have our data in a graph, we understand how to run the graph algorithms. Now we want to enrich our machine learning pipeline. So instead of directly answering a question, what you can do is you can say, I actually have a model that I've built that predicts whether there should be links. I want to use the graph-based features in that model to improve my prediction accuracy. So here, what we're doing is feature engineering. So you're combining and processing your data to create new, more meaningful features. And you're using the graph to create basically your network topology as features in your machine learning pipeline. So I still have my knowledge graph, my foundational piece. And now what I'm doing is I'm running those graph algorithms, I'm creating new features, and then I can put those features into my machine learning pipeline to make a prediction. And when relationships are important, when relationships matter in your data set, typically you see a big improvement in the accuracy of your model. So in one proof of concept I was working on this week, when we added graph-based features, we saw a 10% increase in accuracy. So when relationships are important, adding those graph-based features in lets you get at those when you're making your predictions. When we talk about what's next, so most of our existing customers, most of our use cases right now are focused on those first 3 steps. I need my data in a graph, I want to do graph analytics, I want to do machine learning. Our next release of the GDS library will include graph embedding. So those are those special customized algorithms just for your data. And really the long-term direction is graph neural networks. But taken together, there's value at each step. It's easy to start off with your data in a graph, and there's plenty of room to grow. So I talked a lot about what graph data science is. What does this have to do with Neo4j? So really, Neo4j is making this evolution from data to graph to analytics to machine learning possible. And when we talk about Neo4j for enterprise graph data science, we're talking about three things. So we have our core database, Neo4j itself, and that's letting you hold your graphy data in a graph shape. It's persistent, it's updatable, you can query it. It's a really efficient database. On top of that, we have the Graph Data Science Library, which is a plugin, which lets you do scalable graph algorithms and analytics. So that lets you do your analytics and your machine learning workflows. And then we also offer visualization tools like Bloom and Lincurious to let you understand your data. So you can run your algorithms, you can write those results to your database, and you can explore them in Bloom and understand, what does this mean? When we talk about the Graph Data Science Library itself, we're talking about two things. So first and foremost, the graph algorithms. So you've heard me talk about these this whole presentation. This is at the heart of our library. These are hardened, validated graph algorithms that let you reason about your network structure. So you already have your data. What you're doing with the algorithms is you're generating more, you're extracting more information. So you're doing things like deep path analytics. You're doing community and neighbor detection. You're figuring out who's influential or who's risky. You're doing disambiguation and you're looking at links. And the graph algorithms themselves scale into the tens of billions of nodes. They're super fast, they're really robust. We spent a lot of time optimizing them to make sure that they can run at scale. But the other piece, and the piece that I don't know that everyone realizes, they're like, yeah, graph data science, graph algorithms, got it. The other piece is the graph catalog. And so what this is it's a graph analytics workspace that lets you take that underlying Neo4j database, and it lets you reshape and subset it into these in-memory computational graphs, which are optimized for these global traversals and aggregations. They're the secret sauce of why our graph algorithms are so fast. And it also lets you flexibly reshape your data. So I have my knowledge graph. It has all the information I might want in it, but maybe I want to run an algorithm just on the gene-gene interaction network. Or maybe I only want to look at this subset of the graph, or things that are 5 hops out from this thing. Or maybe only chemicals and drugs, nothing else. The graph catalog lets you really rapidly iterate on, here's my full graph, I want to subset into this, I want to answer this question, and I want to layer these together. So it's really built to support production workflows, highly parallelized, enterprise supported. So taken together between the algorithms and the catalog, you really have the toolbox to do graph data science. Wrapping all of this up, kind of the bow on the package, is we've spent a lot of time simplifying and standardizing our API. So it's really easy to get up and running. So if you want to do graph data science, you learn the syntax once. We have training, documentation, examples, so you can get started. We spent a lot of time on making it so it's really hard to do things that are wrong. So let's say you put an undirected graph in, but the graph algorithm expects a directed graph. Instead of giving you a result that's wrong, we just say, hey, you gave us a directed graph, we need an undirected graph, please reload it. So we've put a lot of guardrails in place so that you can have confidence that your results make sense, as well as all of this work to reshape and do, here's my knowledge graph, I want to subset it, I want to transform it. We make it so you can do that really quickly. And then finally, once you've done all your graph data science, you can explore graphs and algorithm results visually in Bloom and share those across teams. So it's not just one data scientist working in a silo. Bloom lets you work and collaborate for kind of better insights. And kind of the bottom line is, if anyone has tried to do graph data science before, maybe you've used NetworkX or iGraph or something like GraphX, it's hard. So I have my data in tables. How do I shape it as a graph in the first place? How do I pick which algorithms answer the right questions? There's tons of open source libraries out there, no documentation, nothing to tell me what's going to run and how much data it can handle. Once I've picked a library, the syntax is inconsistent. It's hard. I have to build an ETL pipeline to transform my data into the right shape for that particular library and to do something with it to get it back out and save it. And then when I've said, fine, maybe I got all this to work, good job me, how do I put that into production? Do these things even scale? When we talk about using Neo4j, we've really tried to simplify the experience. So you're not worrying about data modeling. With Neo4j, your data is already in a graph. When you're looking at which algorithm should I use, we have 5 clear categories. We have spent a lot of time with customers validating the algorithms, so making sure we support the most valuable ones with all the features you need. We have clear documentation and tutorials. The syntax is easy and standardized, so it's not a huge burden to learn it, and we have tools to help you get started. When you need to reshape your data, it's not building an ETL pipeline. It's I have my full knowledge graph. I'm going to use that graph catalog, and it's as simple as typing graph.create, seamlessly reshaping your data with one command. And because GDS is integrated with the database, once you've run your graph data science, you've calculated the things you want to use, you can just write those results back to your database and move straight to production. So hopefully you'll have the heart-shaped eye emoji at the end of this experience. And if you kind of zoned out, the bottom line with GDS, what's the big deal about graph data science? You can improve your predictions. You can get your models into production. You answer questions that you can't otherwise. You increase your accuracy. GDS is really the first graph data science framework with enterprise features, scale, and support. And it's practical and easy to use. And so with that, quick screen grab of some resources. If you're excited, you can go to our download center to download the library or check out our GitHub. We have a whole book on graph algorithms, as well as check out our Neo4j sandbox, which lets you experiment online. And feel free to reach out. And just a quick plug for our virtual events later on this month and next month, talking about life sciences in healthcare, mitigation, telco, and government. And with that, I will hand it back to Andy.
Thanks very much, Alicia. Yeah, I just thought it'd be worth pointing out for anybody who might have joined a little bit late, or anybody who wants to go back to those links that Alicia just shared and maybe check them out in a little bit more detail, that this session will be available on demand almost instantaneously, almost as soon as it finishes. So you can go back in, you can pause on some slides, you can rewind and have a look at some of the stuff that came earlier. In the meantime, though, we need to go on to our second presenter, Matthew Selwood from IQVIA. I think I've said that right this time, which is a first. So without further ado, and he's doing a live demo, so may the gods of live demos be forever in your favor, Matthew. Take it away.
All right, let me just share my screen. Okay. Okay, all right, can you see my screen?
We can.
Good, excellent. All right, okay, so let me just introduce myself. So I'm Matthew Selwood. I'm currently a product manager at IQVIA. This is actually a kind of a side project that I've been working on, because in my prior life, I was a cheminformatician, and cheminformatics is the study of chemistry plus informatics, and informatics is actually what data science was called before it's called. So that's that, or at least that's how I like to present it. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is this open source project that I'm working on. It's called Matched Molecular Pair Knowledge Graph. It's an open source library for creating a knowledge graph from chemistry, and enables you to explore this, and it uses the matched molecular pair algorithm underneath in order to create this kind of library, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a second. Right, so why chemistry? Well, I think one of the simple reasons is that actually molecules are graphs in the first place. So they're a great place to start your graph science from. So in the molecule, so this is caffeine here. Hopefully you've all had some caffeine already today. Drink some tea or some coffee. So here we have nodes, which are atoms. So you've got a nitrogen atom attached to a carbon atom attached to an oxygen atom. And then the edges are the bonds between them. So this is a single bond, this is a double bond. Hopefully you're remembering kind of like your very early education chemistry here. Nice reminder. But also, we can also represent the molecules as a whole and their interactions with other molecules in a graph as well. And so here we have an example of different molecules, A and B and C, reacting with each other. So this is a reaction of a molecule. So here, molecule A is reacting with molecule B to form this new molecule, molecule AB. And so we can represent this in a graph as well. So we can have molecule A and molecule B as nodes. We can have edges between them that say like A reacts with B, and then we can have edges between the molecule B and say also A, and the new molecule AB to say forms new molecule AB. And so we can start to build up these chemistry within a knowledge graph. And so it's quite natural to fit this in. You have these transactional type use cases with molecules where they undergo reactions or they're kind of interacting and kind of forming different properties, but also they in themselves are graphs. And so it's a nice symbiont in terms of how it all fits together. So why should we care about chemistry? I mean, hopefully I answer this, but chemistry is everywhere. It's a great thing. You would not be alive without it. But some of the I guess like the industries that care about chemistry, so the oil and gas industry, everything there is kind of built around chemistry. The cosmetics manufacturers and the electronics manufacturers, even so like down to like the chemicals that make up your screen. So kind of the organic LEDs that are inside your screen, that's all kind of very clever chemistry. But the one thing I'm going to talk about today mainly is the pharmaceutical industry. And the reason for this is essentially like the cost of making new drugs is really, really expensive. So it costs an estimated 2.6 billion to generate a new drug, and a significant chunk of that cost actually comes from the research and development. Clinical trials is all kind of part of that, but actually the creation of the molecule itself and kind of like the iteration and how you need to get to that final molecule, which is suitable for going into the body of someone and is not toxic and gets to the site of interest and can treat the disease that you're interested in treating, is a really expensive process. And anything we can do to try and cut down that process and kind of get to the insights quicker and get to the end result quicker is really beneficial. So now we come to the data. So chemistry data, and even if we're talking about just the drug-like space, is really, really big. So the actual just drug-like space, the chemical structures that can be in that drug-like space are actually estimated to be between 10 to the 23 and 10 to the 60 compounds. That's just such a huge amount of space. And actually, in the background here, I've got 17 million molecules represented at the background of the slide. So this just kind of give an idea of how big chemistry space is. This is developed from this comes from a research group in the University of Bern, from John Louis Raymond's group, where they actually work on enumerating all of chemical space. So far, they've enumerated all chemical space up to 17 atoms, up to 17 heavy atoms. And this database is called GDB17. It contains 166 billion structures, just if you use 17 atoms in terms of the number of molecules that you can make from just 17 atoms. And so the second part of this is actually the properties of these molecules. So whilst we kind of, it's nice to have the structures, we actually need to know kind of the properties about them and also how they react. So in terms of how they react, the largest database here, which is Reactors, contains over 42 million reactions. And this is just a fraction of the number of reactions that are possible. We're still kind of exploring, and often these reactions are very centered around a very small amount of chemical space. The same thing is true of properties as well. So when you're in the process of kind of designing molecules, what you tend to do is you tend to stay in kind of a very local chemical space, iterating making very small changes, and actually being able to get kind of enough data so that it generalizes across chemical space and represents the entire chemical space. Even on a single property, something like blood-brain barrier penetration or kind of gut absorption or solubility of a molecule is very difficult just because the space is so large. So we were looking for like, what can we do with the small amount of data that we have? How can we make the most out of it? And this is where we can start to use kind of techniques like matched molecular pairs. So matched molecular pairs is a fairly simple concept. So essentially, it's a bit like spot the difference, right? So here we've got two molecules, molecule 1 and molecule 2, and the only thing that's changing between them is the color of the square. And so if this was a molecule that I was kind of changing, I might be changing a nitrogen atom for a carbon atom, or I might be changing a whole part of it. But it's essentially you change a single part of the molecule, and everything else of that molecule is the same as it was before. So you're really able to then work out the delta in terms of what you changed. And imagine you had a property associated with this. So maybe this had a melting point. So this had a melting point of 37 degrees. This compound had a melting point of 39 degrees. Then the delta between them would be 2 degrees. And then what we can do is, as we build up data in the database, we can start to build up statistical significance to say that whenever I change a pink blob for an orange blob, the change is always 2 degrees in melting point, and we can start to build inference and learn from this. So now, what is MMPKG? So Matched Molecular Paired Knowledge Graph. So it's an open source Python package for building specifically a Neo4j database of matched molecular pairs. It's located in GitHub here. And the reason it was built is because essentially I was looking for a way to extract new insights from sparse chemical data using graph technology. And so this is built using the open source toolkit RDKit, which is a chemistry toolkit which enables you to kind of manipulate chemistry using Python. And then also the algorithm itself comes from MMPDB, which contains the matched molecular pair algorithm, which is also located within the RDKit repository. So in terms of what the schema looks like, this took kind of like a bit of time to get right in terms of the use case. But here, essentially, we have orange nodes, which are the molecules, so the compounds. And here you can see we've got relationships between them, saying that these two molecules are matched molecular pairs of each other. And these two molecules are matched molecular pairs of each other is because they both swapped this fragment for this. So they swapped this fragment for this fragment. So essentially, we've changed one part of this molecule and one part of this molecule, and it's the same part, the same area of the molecule that's changed, and we've changed it from here to here. And then we've got additional edges here, and these ones actually contain, each edge here contains a single property of the molecule. So here we have, in the cases that this fragment has been changed to this fragment, we've had 6 different properties measured against it. So this one might be solubility, and so these actually then contain those deltas I was talking about. So this might contain that 2 degree delta, this one might contain a change in solubility measurement, and we can start to build this up as information across different molecules and different data sets. So how can we use graph data science for this? So Alicia talked through kind of the graph data science kind of library and how it can help us. And so I'm going to pick up kind of 3 core use cases here. So the first one Alicia mentioned, so node similarity. And here we're simply looking to see whether we can find compounds which are similar to each other based on the fragments that make up their core structure. So the matched molecular pair algorithm breaks down the molecules into its fragments and then looks to see what the interactions between them are. And so what we can do is we can use these fragments to see whether molecules are similar based on the fragments that they contain. The second use case is PageRank. So here what we're actually going to do is look to see whether we can find fragments of a molecule which, when they're changed, have a high impact on the network. And what do we mean by that? We mean, so in chemistry, when we're designing a new molecule or a new drug, what we're looking for is things which have the highest likelihood to give us a change that we're after. So in this case, if we weight the PageRank by the property that we're interested in, we can see whether we can find fragments which have the highest likelihood of having an impact on that property. So this is what we'll look at. And then the final one is link prediction. So here what we're doing is we're seeing if we can actually find alterations that have not been made before in this data set, but changes that you might expect to be made based on the data that it has seen. So this is what we're going to try and find is to find changes, kind of a suggested change, basically. So like, it's like almost in Amazon, it's like, oh, you bought this, would you like to buy this? So now I'm going to jump out to the demo. So hopefully this goes smoothly. So I've written, so this is in the Jupyter Notebook in Python. So for all of those of you who like Python, then there are connectors, so you can connect to Neo4j in Python. Here, what I've got is I've got a Neo4j database running in the background, which was created using the MMPKG tool. It's currently loaded in desktop. And here we can see the database running. So here are some of the fragment nodes and some of the compound nodes. So just to prove that it's live and that it's there. So first of all, we're gonna connect to the graph. And now Alicia mentioned the in-memory graphs. And so here, what we're going to do is actually build different graphs for different queries that we're going to run. So the reason I did this is because it's quite a nice way to ensure that you're running the algorithm on the data that you want. So here, for example, I've taken just the compound and the fragment nodes and only the isFragment of edges. So let's create that graph. So here we've said we've got 5,000 nodes and 7,500 edges. And then I wanted the reverse of that. So here, this is taking into account two directional, like a single directionality. So the directionality that's in the graph. So Neo4j has directed edges. So here, this is just one direction. And actually then I wanted a graph which had the reverse direction in as well. So let's create that one. And here I wanted one which only represented fragments and didn't have compounds. And then finally, I wanted one which was undirected and only contained fragments and a single type of environment. So it's quite useful because you can start to take your main graph and break it down into kind of subgraphs of these in-memory graphs that you can just select the key parts of the information that you need for running your algorithm. And I think it's quite a nice way to keep track of what you're working on. It kind of keeps it nicely separated from, so you make sure that you're running your graph query on the right subset of your data. So now we can just check to see that they're all loaded. Yeah, here we go. So here we've got our 4 graphs that we've just run. And now we can kind of jump into node similarity. So here what I'm doing is I've written a Cypher query, and we're asking it to find similar nodes, so similar compound nodes in this sense to each other based on the fragments. And so here we're using the graph data science syntax using GDS.node similarity, and we're streaming the results back. And then what we're going to do is we're going to convert them into a pandas data frame and also display them using our dkit. And so when we run that, we get these list of molecules. And I can tell you now that actually these two molecules don't look very similar to me, even though we have a very high similarity. And the reason for this is actually we've not taken into account all of the different factors here yet. So these molecules are similar because they only share one fragment, and that fragment is this part of the molecule here. So in order to get a more realistic approach, we actually need to make sure that the similarity algorithm is only taking into account, or we only look at those molecules which have a high number of fragments that are shared. So if we scroll down, the way that we can, so first of all, let's write our similarity out to the graph. We were only streaming it before, so let's actually write this out to our main graph. Once that's written, there we go. Should be able to go back to our graph, and we should start to see a new property appear. So what we do in order to find out how many fragments are attached, we can use the degree algorithm. So this one simply tells us how many edges are attached to our node, and we can specify those edges. So so here we're going to find out the number of nodes that are attached to a fragment node, the number of fragments that are attached to a compound node, and the number of fragments that are attached to a fragment node. And we've written these 3 all out to the graph as well as properties on the individual nodes. And then the final thing, let's kind of add a bit more information in before we look at the final kind of result of the similarity. There's many existing similarity algorithms already in chemistry. So what we're going to do is actually just run a few of those as well. So we're going to calculate a circular fingerprint here. So this is a Morgan fingerprint. And then we're also going to calculate a kind of a max fingerprint. So this is another fragment-based type fingerprint. So there's 166 keyed fragments, which are encoded within max fingerprints. So let's run those. That takes a bit of time to run. And then once that's run, you essentially get this. So now we can just run this, and it will output the data. So here now we can actually see the molecules returned are much more similar to each other. So they've got a much higher amount of the original backbone, the original part of the molecule, kind of similar. And this is because now we're looking at looking at compounds that have over 15 fragments attached to them. So there's a lot higher number of nodes for it to sample from in order to calculate the similarity. So here it's saying that these ones actually have completely identical fragments based on the fragmentation algorithm that we're using. And if we compare these to the other two algorithms, so here we get quite a high max fragment similarity. So this favors this kind of correlates quite well. The Morgan similarity here is slightly lower. The reason for this though is actually the 0.5 here does actually still represent a fairly similar molecule, because when you with Morgan, kind of the area that you select for being highly similar is generally somewhere above 0.3 or 0.4. So the range of kind of what you get in the 0 to 1 is not as well normalized as it could be. So actually above 0.3 and 0.4 is actually representative of similar. So here actually we are actually getting something which is saying that it's similar, even though it doesn't appear as high a number as the other two. Right. Okay. So now we can see we've got lots more other fragments. If we go down to the bottom, we get some work which look a bit different as well. So just to say, so there are some here that are similar, but not necessarily the same structures. So the second thing we're going to look at is PageRank. So here we want to find fragments which are important based on their place in the fragment network, but also weight them based on that property we mentioned before. So here we've written two types of PageRank to the graph. So we've written the weighted PageRank and the unweighted PageRank. Here we've weighted it based on the property change, this average value from the graph, and then we've returned the data. And so here what we can see is the most kind of the fragment that's changed that has the biggest impact on the graph is actually hydrogen. This is probably something not too unexpected, because it's something that we can change quite frequently on a molecule, and actually is changed quite frequently by chemists. But in this data set, it actually is both weighted highly in the unweighted and also in the weighted. So it means that when we're not weighted by the property, it has a high impact on the network, but still when we are weighted based on this property, changing hydrogen seems to be a thing which will have an impact on your molecule. You should be changing this if you want to have an impact either. At the moment, we're not actually looking at the directionality of the change, so this could be a negative or a positive change. But in general, if you want to change something, changing hydrogen is probably a good thing to do. Molecules are covered in hydrogen. There's lots of things to change, so that should be fairly easy. The next one down, changing this benzene molecule, that also seems to be a fairly positive thing to do as well. It's quite a common change in drug discovery to kind of lop off a benzene and swap it for something else, or even substitute it in some way. So this is starting to tell us a bit about our data sets. So if we just go down, so finally go to link prediction. So here we talked about finding links between fragments, and this is because it's not actually useful in this data set to predict links between compounds. Because compounds are either matched molecular pairs of each other defined by the algorithm, or they are not. And so there's no reason to predict it. It's either true or it's false. So the link prediction algorithm we're going to use to predict between fragments, about whether the fragments are related, is going to be the Adama-Kadar algorithm. And so here we're going to run the Adama-Kadar algorithm, and what we're going to look for is things where there isn't an existing matched molecular pair rule environment edge. So we're not looking for it to return a score on those which actually already have an edge. We're only looking for it to return the edges that do not exist yet. So here, when we start to look at this, we can see changing. So we get them in both directions again because we've not specified direction in our query. So here we can see swapping this fragment for this fragment has not actually been seen in this data set yet. And so you can think when you're designing a molecule, maybe this is something that I might want to change. Maybe if I have this in my molecule, I can swap it for this. Or maybe if I have this, I can swap it for that. Or if I have a fluorine, I might swap it for a para-substituted fluorine on a benzene ring. So it starts to throw up these suggestions that you can start to make in your molecules when you're designing compounds, in terms of things to think about. What unfortunately this link prediction algorithm doesn't give you is the ability to actually suggest what the property is. This is where kind of the future steps of this project come in terms of using actually machine learning. So instead of using this to predict links directly in the graph using the graph algorithms library, what we would do is use the graph algorithm features, extract those features, and then use them in a machine learning algorithm to predict new edges. So this is kind of like the next step for this project, is how can you then use these graph algorithms in machine learning to predict some more of the things that you want and embed more of the information that we need. And with that, I shall just finish. I think we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'll hand back to Andy for questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Matthew. I'll just wait until we get back to the video screens. Yes, so like I mentioned before, if there's anything you'd like to go over with Matthew's presentation and have a look at again, we will be available on demand shortly after this finishes. Also want to flag you up to the attachments in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. We've got a couple of webinars coming up with that. We're taking a look at Apache Flink next week, and we've got some in the weeks after that you might like to sign up for. In terms of questions, we've got a few from the audience. I thought I might just put one to Alicia first about RDF and similarities to Cypher language. You can presumably see the question, Alicia. What similarities and drawbacks or differences between the two languages for the database?
Sure. So when we talk about RDF, that's another format for representing graphs. So I talked about how Neo4j is a labeled property graph. You can also have graph data stored in an RDF, like a triple store. And just like Neo4j has Cypher to query it, there are RDF query languages like Sparkle. And you can kind of think of them as analogous. So Sparkle is how you query your data when it's in an RDF. Cypher is how you query your data when it's in a labeled property graph. When we talk about RDF versus labeled property graph, I mean, a lot of it comes down to your use case. So basically, the underlying data structure for Neo4j is really engineered for these pattern matching, like long multi-hop traversals, as well as running these graph algorithms and these global aggregations. And labeled property graphs are much better suited to be able to do those very quickly and at scale. The other difference between a labeled property graph and RDF is RDF operates based on ontologies. So really strict, like this is a parent of this, I have a controlled vocabulary. Whereas labeled property graphs are schema-free or schema-optional. And so you can kind of add data in much more easily. You don't have to have a defined ontology up front. You can kind of add in your nodes and relationships, and your graph can grow with your data. So those are kind of the relationships and differences.
Perfect, thank you. And now a little bit more of a kind of a general question for both of you in terms of when you're doing this sort of thing, or you're doing it with your team, or doing it from a company perspective. What are the sort of hurdles that people run into, and I guess how do they get over them? So we end with a more positive end to that question.
I think with the hurdles with Neo4j, it's really starting to think about graphs. So a lot of data scientists have spent a lot of their careers staring at tables. And it's really understanding, how do I reshape my data into the right shape to represent it as a graph? So what are the relationships between my data points? Where do they come from? What should be a relationship versus a node versus a property? And you get a lot of performance out of doing that. The other hurdles, I think, are understanding what's a graph question and what's not, and where graphs add value, and making sure that when you're trying to use graph data science, that you're doing it on something where there is a benefit to graph. So if you have a graph, if you have a Neo4j graph where there are no relationships, running GDS on it isn't going to be very insightful. And I think, previously I'd say a hurdle was communicating your results. So I ran community detection, I found these things, what does that mean? But now that we integrate with Bloom, which is a visualization tool, that makes it much easier to kind of share your data. I don't know, Matt, what are your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with the things that you've said. I think, yeah, definitely one of the things is making sure you put your data in the right format and you think about the question you want to ask before you do it. I think that's one thing. So I think lots of people are like very excited about graphs and graph technology, but actually kind of like thinking about actually like, is this a graph-based problem that I need to solve, or would it be better solved by a different technology? And I think there are a lot of problems currently being solved by the wrong technology within companies, and I think a general thing is just making sure that kind of the experience and the expertise exists, and that I think like having companies like Neo4j and also like experts in the field, I think the online community is very helpful as well, that you can like reach out to and kind of ask about, is this a sensible thing to be doing? Because it's like, I think because it's like a reasonably new technology still, having enough kind of volume of people to hire and kind of bring that expertise into your company is not necessarily an easy thing to do. And so finding people that have the expertise and knowing where to get the answers to the questions that you need to answer for your own company is really important.
Perfect, thank you. And actually, just staying on people and drilling down a little bit further, for any managers or team leaders or whatever who are watching, what are the characteristics or technical skills, I guess, of the kind of people that you need to make the most of this? I mean, is there any kind of personality traits or technical skill or something, just so that if people are looking to add to their team or looking at existing team to see where they can improve it, or whether it's a whether it's a good idea?
That's a really good question. I guess the expectation is I'm going to say like you should know Neo4j, but I think really it's curiosity. I think Neo4j is a company we've spent a lot of time making sure that it's easy to get started, that you can just download desktop, get up and running. You can use Sandbox. You can call these things easily. It's really about, I'm curious. I want to answer a question. I want to find a new methodology to do something different. I want to do better every time. So yeah, there's some, basic technical skills, and, you want to understand the fundamentals of data science. But the most important thing is, being excited to learn something new, to apply something new, and to just make things better all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my side, kind of lots of people in my team are able to pick up like graph data science and things like this very easily. I mean, they have a data science background, and so kind of I think if you have a data science background, that helps. But of course, it's not a blocker if you don't. It's just like if you're enthusiastic and you want to learn it, then I think it's something that can easily be picked up, and there's lots of accessible ways in for those that don't have a data science background as well.
Okay, and just to end the sort of question with, I'll put it to you, Matthew, first. It's what would you give advice for somebody who's just starting their journey in this, and any sort of tips for somebody who's, I imagine there's a few on the call right now who haven't done it, who are looking to do it. Just a couple of tips to go forward with.
Yeah, I think probably dive in. Don't be afraid to have a go. I guess the second one would be try lots of different ways of doing it and approaching the problem. I mean, to get to often, I guess, to get to a schema or kind of a way of working in the graph that you're happy with does take quite a lot of time and quite a lot of thinking and whiteboarding. So don't, like I say, get very visual. So like draw stuff out and try and work it out in terms of how you want to represent your data. And then I think the third thing is don't be afraid to reach out and ask questions. I think the community is very helpful, and there's no stupid questions. And so, like, if you want to reach out, there's the Neo4j community, and then there's other communities as well, such as on Stack Overflow, etc., where feel free to ask questions, and people who have answers will attempt to help you.
Perfect. I think that's the great advice, and it seems like a great community as well. So yeah, no, definitely dive in. There's some resources on the Neo4j website, which are on the attachments at the left-hand side. However, I think it's about time that we wrap this one up. And firstly, I'd just like to say a big thank you to our two presenters who did an excellent job today. So thank you very much, Alicia, and thank you very much, Matthew. But for now, from Big Data London and from our two presenters, it's goodbye. So we'll catch you on the next one. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.